Mr. Paul Whalen, our keynote speaker, is a licensed attorney and has lived in Fort Thomas for 30 years and in Northern Kentucky for 35 years. In addition to his law degree, Paul has 2 degrees in history. He assisted in successful Kentucky historical highway marker projects, including the Highland United Methodist Church and Evergreen Cemetery's marker, Congressman Buried in Evergreen Cemetery. Paul has a passion for documenting elected government officials and has worked on research projects such as the history of Kentucky governors and the subject of his presentation today, Kentucky's United States Senators from Northern Kentucky. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Paul Whalen.
Thank you, Bridget. Thank you, everybody on the Northern Kentucky History Day Committee. I appreciate the warm welcome.
Can you lift the microphone?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
All right, thank
You're a
you.
little taller than she is.
Yes. All right. Today, I'd like to welcome you to my presentation on U.S. Senators from Northern Kentucky. I didn't have an animated picture of a United States Senator from Northern Kentucky to welcome you, but I have this picture of United States Senator Ollie James. He was a senator from Kentucky from about 1913 to 1920, oh actually 1918 because he died in office. So in your handout, many of you, these will be the 10, 2, 4, 6, 11 people that we will review today. This is not, we're not going to go into depth. This is sort of like a survey of individuals. Actually, they're all men who have a connection to Northern Kentucky or were living in Northern Kentucky when they were elected to the United States Senate. Now, to give you a little idea about this United States Senate, first of all, senators were not elected by the people until 1914 with the advent of the 17th Amendment. Prior to that, until the advent of the 17th Amendment, your United States Senator was elected by your state legislature. And sometimes those elections in the legislature could take up to 6 months, as they did a couple of times in the 1890s. But as part of the progressive movement of the 1880s and 1890s, there was an amendment to the United States Constitution which allowed everybody to elect their own, everybody to vote for your United States Senator. A guy by the name of J.C.W. Beckham was the first United States Senator from Kentucky elected by the popular vote, which was sort of interesting because he was a Kentucky governor that succeeded William Goebel after he was shot. And he won the Democratic nomination for the U.S. Senate, I believe, in 1908, but the legislature did not see fit to elect him to the United States Senate. Now, Kentucky's first senators, just to give you a little background, John Brown, who's the guy on the far left from Franklin County, was considered the first United States Senator from Kentucky. He was the member of Class 2 of 3. If you recall, when you elect senators, there's every 2 years there's an election for somewhere in the United States for United States Senate. And it's elected 1/3 of the Senate, so the Class 1 is elected in 1 year, then the following year there's Class 2, well 2 years later, then 2 years later is Class 3. This year, Kentucky, since Kentucky does not have a Class 1 United States Senator, we have no U.S. Senate elections. However, in 2020, we have a Class 2 Senate election, and so forth. Now, John Edwards, and then of course the second guy, the guy with his hand out in front of him, was Senator John Edwards from Bourbon County. Now they drew straws to determine, first of all, Brown got the 6-year term and Edwards got a 2-year term. But they were elected by the legislature in 1792 when it was meeting in Lexington. Now, where are Kentucky's United States Senators from? As you can see, Fayette County right now has produced, or has been the home of the most United States Senators, with 7. Franklin County, 6. Jefferson, 6. And of course, our present United States Senator McConnell is from Jefferson County. Kenton County has had 5. Bet you all didn't know. How many people knew that? 5. That Kenton County had 5 United States Senators. Woodford County, 5. Bourbon County, 4. Warren County, Bowling Green, has had 4, and our current United States Senator Rand Paul is from Bowling Green. Now, what we're going to start on, I thought was also important, is the United States Senators born or lived in northern Kentucky who have represented other states in the United States Senate. And as you can see from the slide, we've got northern Kentucky has sent senators to Illinois, Missouri, and Arizona. And their pictures are on the second line of your handout. Jesse Thomas from Mason County was the first senator from Illinois. Richard Yates, born in Warsaw and grew up in Gallatin County, was a U.S. senator from Illinois. He was also Civil War governor. Orville Hickman Browning was born near Cynthiana. Harry Hawes, born in Covington, grew up in Covington. And Marcus Smith, born near Cynthiana. So we have had some northern Kentuckians go to other states, which isn't really surprising considering we're on the Ohio River and border a couple of other states. Now, Jesse Thomas is interesting for a couple of reasons. He was your county clerk in Mason County. He left Mason County, Maysville. He left Mason County and went to Lawrenceburg, Indiana, a little farther down the river, and where he became Indiana's territorial congressman. And while he was congressman, or the territorial representative in Congress, he helped create the Illinois Territory, which became a state in 1818. This is the 200th anniversary of the state of Illinois statehood. And guess what? He became the first U.S. Senator from the state of Illinois. All right, Orville Hickman Browning, he's important, at least from around, he graduated from Augusta College from Bracken County. Anybody here from Bracken County? Okay. He was a senator from Illinois from 1861 to 1863. He was appointed. He was sort of one of these antagonistic friends of Abraham Lincoln, and he was Secretary of the Interior under Andrew Johnson from 1866 to 1869. The next guy we talked about, Richard Yates, born in Warsaw. He was educated in Kentucky, Transylvania University. He got his law degree there, and he was there, the state of Illinois' Civil War governor. The next guy, probably one of the more important people who have come from northern Kentucky, is Marcus A. Smith, born near Cynthiana, was a territorial delegate from Arizona for more than 20 years, and he was their first United States Senator when Arizona became a state in 1912. Okay? I want to point out here, there's Marcus Smith. The guy next with him is Albert Fall, who was the first senator from New Mexico who was born in Frankfurt. However, if you recall, in the 1920s, the Teapot Dome scandal, he was the Secretary of Interior who went to prison. But he was from Kentucky. One thing about Senator Smith, he is, rather than being buried in Arizona, he is buried in Battle Grove Cemetery in Cynthiana. Harry Hawes from Covington, he was a senator in the 1920s, born in Covington. His grandfather was the second Confederate governor of Kentucky. He's probably most famous for the Hare-Hawes Cutting Act, which gave independence to the Philippines over a 10-year period. Of course, it wasn't smooth because during part of that 10-year period they were occupied by Japan.
Yes.
But the enabling law has his name on it. And he was from Covington, although he represented Missouri. Now, getting into the United States senators who actually lived in Covington during their adult life, the first one we'll talk about, actually the very first senator who was from northern Kentucky, actually is John Turner Moorhead. He is a former Kentucky governor. He's the guy that the city of Moorhead is named after. And he was senator from 1841 to 1847. His Senate record doesn't have much to say for itself. He was, in part, that might be because he was dominated by John J. Crittenden. And when you served with John J. Crittenden or Henry Clay, either one of those fellows during the period before 1860, you most likely either were his enemy, or those guys' enemy, or you didn't get a word in edgewise. And it seems that's what happened with Moorhead. After he left the Senate, he came to Covington to practice law, and it was in Covington where he died, I believe, in 1854. So, although originally when he was elected to the Senate and when he was elected governor, he was from Bowling Green. Again, another fellow from Warren County. Now, the first senator, most of you are probably familiar with John W. Stevenson, John White Stevenson. Everybody, and of course, his home was, I think, the state employment, on the side of the state employment office as you come across the bridge from Newport. There's a plaque there, and also the old legal, there's a plaque on Greenup Street where he lived. And also, he was very active in the Episcopalian Church there in Covington. They've got a plaque crediting him for, I forget exactly, started a vocational school at that site with the Episcopalian Church. He served from 1877 to 1871 to 1877. It was a rather controversial election, and he was challenged to a duel by one of his competitors. See, it was being decided by the legislature, and right now the name of the fellow from Newport escapes me, who was about ready to go to fisticuffs with him over the nomination. They were both Democrats, and it was an interesting confrontation. Of course, Stevenson won the election in the legislature. To explain how it went in the legislature, both the 100 members of the House and the 38 members of the Kentucky Senate voted together to elect a senator, and I believe in order to get elected, it was not a majority, it was a supermajority. You had to get over 50%, so you're looking at about 68 to 69 votes to get elected United States Senator, and that's why it took more than one vote. sort of like the old political conventions. One of his major accomplishments as a United States Senator was to keep the Newport Barracks in Newport. You know, the Newport Barracks, I think we're going to have a talk on that a little later today, was the forerunner of Fort Thomas before they moved it up the hill. They were considering, because it was getting flooded out quite a bit, it was right there on the Licking, and where the Licking and the Ohio come together, and we know what it looks like today. So they were having issues. They were thinking about moving that base to Columbus, and John W. Stevenson did stop that from happening. And as a result, later it was moved up to the Highlands, which is now Fort Thomas. While he was United States Senator, he was the Democratic or Minority Caucus leader, which is sort of interesting because he was there during the 1876 election. And does anybody know what happened in the 1876 election? Anyway, it was a disputed election. There was a tie between Samuel, or almost a tie between, or allegedly, I see Jeff Hampton shaking his head. But anyway, it was decided by Congress because of some Confederate votes. And you would have thought that he would have been a partisan for the Democrat Samuel Tilden of New York. However, he did not say anything, which makes you think that he might have been part of the deal which allowed Rutherford B. Hayes to get elected and therefore remove Reconstruction from the South. So that's because he came home to Covington from Washington and was asked a question by the forerunner of the Inquirer about what about the election, Mr. Stevenson, and he really didn't give an answer. Yeah, he did have Southern sympathies. His dad was originally from, I think, Richmond, Virginia. After he left, Stevenson became president of the American Bar Association. You know, he was a very, very active Cincinnati attorney and involved in national circles. Between Stevenson and our next United States Senator from Northern Kentucky, we have a guy named Barney Beck of Lexington, who served from 1877 to 1890. And the reason I bring up Senator Beck, because he, at this point, is the only foreign-born United States Senator from Kentucky. Senator Beck was born in Scotland, was educated there, came to New York for farming. I think in the 1840s, of course, there was a lot of agriculture problems during this time. He knew a lot about shepherding, which was interesting because when he was a United States Senator, one of the little things that he occasionally would do would be shear a sheep. And he could do it rather quickly. In fact, he could show another person and he could take a sheep and shear it in 3 to 5 minutes. And you got to remember that's without electric shears. And we'll talk about Carlisle in a minute, but Carlisle and Senator Beck were on the opposite side of the tariff issue. Now, if you go to Lexington and go to Rupp Arena, his home, Beck's home, is about 4 blocks south of Rupp Arena, and there it is, the Beck Mansion.
Well, they didn't tear that down, did they?
No, it's been, I think it's offices now.
Toward Carlisle, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Stevenson.
Yes, Stevenson's. All right, the next fellow, and probably the most, the United States Senator that has had the most political impact during his time as a United States Senator or as an office holder was John G. Carlisle. But he served only a small period of time in the United States Senate. He was elected to replace Bernie Beck when Beck had a heart attack and died. And as you can see, Carlisle only served in the United States Senate for about 3 years. However, part of the reason he is important, not as only as a United States Senator, was because he was Speaker of the United States House of Representatives for about 6 years. He was the second Kentuckian to serve as Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives. The first one being Henry Clay. One of the reasons why I have Mrs. John G. Carlisle's Kentucky Cookbook up there is because she played an important role. I couldn't find a good picture of her, but she played an important role in his life as a politician in Washington. That's being when he was a House Democratic leader. On Wednesdays, Mrs. Carlisle would have afternoon teas. And because of his position as Speaker of the House and being a nice guy, he was able to get the Marine Band to come play. So you had all your Kentucky politicians coming, plus everybody else. And as it points out in the slide, as many as 750 people would come to their home on K Street and for the tea and so when you entertain that much, you're going to be somewhat influential with folks in Washington and home. Now, the reason he resigned, wasn't a senator very long, is because he was a close friend of Grover Cleveland. And when Grover Cleveland had his second term, he made Carlisle his Secretary of the Treasury. And that's his portrait that hangs even today in the Department of the Treasury's office in their gallery of secretaries. He was a member of the low tariff wing of the Democratic Party. It's important to point out that when he did come to the Senate, he had very hard, fast views on tariffs, and so he was elected on May 17th, but did not take his seat in the Senate until the 26th of the same month because he wanted the opportunity to vote against the McKinley tariff, and that's McKinley like after the guy who eventually became president. So he voted against it in the House, and then when he was sworn in the Senate and it came in front of the Senate, he voted against it again. So, yeah, you don't see many folks do that. This is a picture of him with President Cleveland and the rest of Cleveland's cabinet. Sort of a dour bunch there. But he was one of the few that served the entire 4 years until 1896. Other interesting things about him, he was also briefly a law partner with our future governor, Goebel. Not for very long, because there was a difference between him and Goebel. Carlisle was considered more, I guess, in today's world, an elitist, whereas Goebel was considered more of a pro-labor, high tariff. But anyway, here's the legacies to memorialize John G. Carlisle. The elementary school there in Covington. That's perhaps the largest memorial. He is buried in Linden Grove Cemetery in Covington. After leaving the Treasury, he went to New York to practice law. But he's got a nice... Anybody here go to John G. Carlisle? Okay. Got one lady back there. Anybody else? Anybody teach there besides my wife? Okay. Jeff, you didn't teach there? Okay. Next fellow, now this is sort of stretching northern Kentucky. There's a guy by the name of Senator Thomas Painter. He was a congressman from the area around Vanceburg and Greenup. We've included him because most of the time in the fort we include Greenup County as part of the northern Kentucky. He was born in Lewis County. He moved after he went to law school. He moved to, became Greenup County attorney, later a congressman from the district that included Greenup, Vance County, Vanceburg, which is Lewis County. He was U.S. representative from Kentucky's 9th district, and for about 6 years before becoming a member of the Kentucky Court of Appeals. What was interesting in those days until, I guess, the 1950s, many people on the Court of Appeals would use that as a stepping stone for higher office. If you remember Burt Combs was a member of the Kentucky Court of Appeals when he ran for governor the first time. This fella became United States Senator after serving on the Kentucky Court of Appeals. Can't do that today. Painter he defeated a fellow by the name of Blackburn. It was actually probably more interesting than him. But Beckham was becoming almost rather bossy after he became governor. He was the first two-term governor, essentially, because he finished out Gobel's term and then he had his own term. So he was governor about 7 or 8 years at the beginning of the century. And so he became Governor Beckham's choice to become United States Senator, because Governor Beckham did not like Blackburn, who later regained his seat and became, I'm talking about Blackburn, later regained his seat and became governor of Panama. But anyway, that's another. One good thing about Painter, he did speak out against the tobacco trusts in Congress and tried initially to do something. The tobacco trusts are one of the reasons we had the Black Patch Wars in western Kentucky, where the company that the Duke family, which founded Duke University, got their money in, I guess, ripping off Kentucky farmers. That's another reason why the Kentucky people don't like Duke. But we had farmers in western Kentucky who would burn down Duke cigarette properties. I believe it was American Tobacco at that time. They burned down the factory and put their cigarette factory in Paducah, burned down homes of people who sold their tobacco to the Dukes because they were trying to buy it below what it cost a farmer to raise it, because they were the only place to go. He did speak out about that, Painter did, however, and that was one good thing, but he never really did anything. Now, he was on, I guess his most famous thing, well, first of all, he voted for, what I thought was sort of interesting, they had an amendment to the United States Constitution to come to Congress, which would limit the president to 1 6-year term. He did vote for that. Of course, it never went anywhere, as we all know. However, one of the things that he's probably best known for, he was on the committee to investigate the election of Illinois Senator Lamar, the blonde boss, election to the United States Senate. It was alleged that Senator Lamar stuffed ballots and stuff like that. And he was eventually kicked out of the United States Senate, and Painter was on the committee that kicked him out. However, Painter voted against kicking him out, and unfortunately for Painter, the public, after he was not reelected because Ollie James, you know, the guy that was waving his hand at the first slide, was going to run for that seat, and he was rather popular, so he didn't get it. But what happened with Painter was they found out after he left office that Lamar's bank had made some pretty nice loans to Senator Painter while he was being investigated. So I'm not sure we want to claim him. Yeah. But since he was born and elected from northern Kentucky, what can we say? Now the next fella we're going to talk about is Senator Richard P. Ernst. He was elected in 1921. He's not one other than if you're from Covington or go to the YMCA camp here in Camp Ernst, know much about. Or how many people know that Camp Ernst was named for his family? Okay, that's perhaps one of his biggest legacies. His home is there in Covington, right diagonally across from where Senator Stevenson's was. There's his home on Garrett Street. Still there, they've got a marker. He wasn't out to give him credit, although when you read about Ernst and his lifestyle, he was an exceptionally rich Cincinnati lawyer, went to some of the nice schools over there, went to private schools back in the day, and went on overseas trips. But he was an outdoorsman, as you can see with his picture of him in the canoe. He beat Senator Beckham in 1920, although that was the same year that Warren G. Harding ran against James Cox, who was governor of Ohio. And Cox won Kentucky, but yeah, a lot of people split their ticket that year. He was very, it was interesting to note in the New York Times in 1922, after he'd been in Congress almost 2 years, he had never made a speech or made a comment on the Senate floor. He also was a big supporter of Prohibition, but was known to throw wild parties with a lot of booze. One of his crowning achievements was, you might want to say, I would have to say, was that he helped secure the money to continue Dixie Highway out of Cincinnati down through Kentucky. So when you're driving US 25, you can now blame him. He was defeated in 1926 by Alvin Barkley, who was one of Kentucky's political giants, no matter how you look at him. Part of the reason why was because Barkley pounded on the fact that Ernst voted against Civil War and Spanish-American War veterans' pensions legislation in 1924. And also, if you remember, after World War I, there was quite a controversy about the pensions for World War I veterans. And for some reason, he voted against all that type of legislation. And to be fair, I think he was absent in one of those votes, but Barkley hit on him anyway. During the campaign of 1926, it should be noted he advertised on radio, which was so he became one of the first. I don't think it did him a whole lot of good because he did lose against Barkley. But to be fair, Barkley had ran for governor in a primary in 1922 and did fairly well, even though he got beat. But his biggest legacy, of course, is probably the YMCA's Camp Ernst and his work he did to preserve Cumberland Falls, which was done after he was United States Senator. He was president of the Cumberland Falls Preservation Association, and in that capacity, in that position, he was successful in opposing Governor Sampson's proposal to have hydroelectric generators placed there at the falls. And in doing so, he negotiated, because he did run in others, rich people's circles. He knew the DuPonts out of Delaware, and he was able to get them to fund the money to purchase the land that had Cumberland Falls, and it was donated to the state of Kentucky. So we will have to, his legacy is probably more so after he was United States Senator because of what he did for Cumberland Falls and Camp Ernst. Our next and final United States Senator from Northern Kentucky is our one senator from Campbell County, Jim Bunning. He's probably the only member of the United States Senate who was a major league baseball player. I think we've had some minor leaguers, but he was the only one that was a major league professional player and a member of the Baseball Hall of Fame. As we know, when he was a congressman, he had a little sharp edge about him when, on certain political issues. He was a deficit hawk, and of course, if you disagreed with him, you got that sharp edge sometimes. When he ran for the Senate, some people think he mellowed out a little bit because he started talking about cleaning up the environment, and he did vote about the need for education and things like that. One of the biggest things legislatively that Jim Bunning will be known for is the Flood Insurance Reform Act of 2004, which is originally called Two Floods and You're Out. What that did in reforming federal flood insurance, it encouraged people, they would only insure you for only the first two floods. After that, you no longer could get coverage. And he was joined in that with Representative Doug Bruder of Nebraska, Representative Earl Blumenauer, a Democrat from Oregon. Again, that encourages communities to build, if you've been flooded out at least twice, perhaps think about moving your buildings up on higher ground. In regards to his legacy, in addition to the flood insurance, he has made, I think a lot it's overlooked, but he has made the Major League Baseball Players Association perhaps what it is today. And he's one of the reasons why baseball players get the salaries they do. Before he got involved, they got a per diem, they had to sleep 5 to a room, and that doesn't happen today. So he's transformed the Major League Baseball Players Association, one of the most successful labor unions today, which is sort of interesting because it really was not very pro-union for anything else. In regards to his legacy, of course, he thought very highly of his family, and he was instrumental in getting his son, Dave Bunning, who is the U.S. District Judge for the Eastern District of Kentucky, appointed to the bench, and he's turned out to be a pretty good judge. And of course, his grandson, Patrick Tolles, if you're a UK fan. Now, The last slide that I have is, what's the future possibility of electing a U.S. Senator from Kentucky, from Northern Kentucky? Which is a big question, especially since Trey Grayson, the last candidate for U.S. Senator from Northern Kentucky, couldn't even carry Boone County, where he lived. It depends, and of course I've got several points here. Of course, it depends upon when McConnell and Rand Paul decide to retire. And it's my opinion that it depends upon the media coverage in Northern Kentucky. One of the things is Northern Kentucky is the only area of the Commonwealth that does not have its own newspaper, radio, and television station located in its own area. Even Maysville and Ashland have their own daily, Ashland has its daily paper. Northern Kentucky does not. And of course you say the River City News, but that's only a small sliver. You don't have people like, 20 years ago that go to every city hall meeting, school board meeting. You don't know unless something really bad happens or controversial. When Jim Bunning was elected, Kentucky Post was based in Covington, and social media was not a factor. So that's one of the reasons why Northern Kentucky could be at a disadvantage in a lot of ways. We don't have our own media up here. We have to depend on Cincinnati. So, anyway, it's just food for thought. Okay, and this is, of course, the end of my presentation. But I just thought I would point out here at the end, when you see press conferences of senators, whether it be McConnell and Paul or Rick Schumer, you see usually the seal here on the right, United States Senate. That is the unofficial seal. And this is the official seal of the United States Senate, which I thought was sort of interesting. You don't see it as much on television. But anyway, I just thought I'd throw that out as a piece of Senate trivia. Any questions? Okay, thank you.